So one of the most infamous but unique aspects of how EVE Online is run is the fact that its developers, CCP, don't attempt to intervene and ensure fair play and honesty amongst its member base. This means that if you're dumb enough to trade away your armor plates to someone with the vague promise of being trimmed and they just walk away with them, rather than getting your items back after a conversation with a GM, they're likely to laugh at you just as much as the general player base would. Now, that's not to say it's an entirely lawless social sandbox, and extremely offensive language will result in you eventually being punished, but as far as scamming, cheating, cajoling, and conniving your way into other people's stuff goes, as long as you do it within the rules of the game, it's fair play. This has led to all sorts of fascinating and elaborate scams, betrayals, and robberies over the years, from the Guiding Hand Social Club to Judgment Day, which have garnered the game much attention in the wider media, but has also served to exaggerate the threat that such things pose to the average player. So what I want to do today is look away from these acts of high treason and arm you with an understanding of some of the more common ways that EVE players will try and cheat you out of your money, so that you can be prepared to spot and avoid them, or perhaps, if you're more nefarious, put them to work for yourself. After all, only one of these tricks requires any amount of SP, so you could theoretically scam your way into a subscription thanks to the free-to-play option that's introduced a few years ago. Before we get onto the list proper though, I do want to give an honourable mention to a method of scamming which is sadly no longer with us as a result of the changes in the recent free trade patch, and that's trade window scamming. There were many layers to this, but the two of the core tricks that were heavily abused in order to scam have been addressed. The first of these was based around the fact that the trade UI actually retained the assembled nature of ships put inside it, meaning you'd get to see the name assigned by a player over the ship in the trade window instead of its ship type. This allowed scammers to rename, for example, a Scorpion Navy to Rattlesnake, and hope to convince a player to buy it at a quote-unquote discount price, netting the scammer a few $100 million in profit if their victim fell for it. Still, it was relatively easy to defeat by simply right-clicking the item and hitting Show Info before accepting the trade. Now, however, the trade window will always present the ship type to you, preventing this scam from functioning. The other trick was a little more dexterity focused and relied on you lowering the amount of ISK that was entered as an offer in the time between the person dropping the item into it and hitting the accept trade button, hoping that they wouldn't notice the quick trade. Now that you can't actually lower the amount of ISK offered, this is completely impossible, but in the past it made using the trade window a very sketchy proposition. With all of these changes to make it more secure though, the trade window is likely to see a little more usage, especially given the hikes in tax earlier in the year and the fact that direct trades work around this. But be very wary if you do end up using it, and make sure you take the time to read everything carefully before hitting accept, as I'm sure a new breed of scams working around these limitations will spring up, given time and possibility. So the first scam we have on the list might not be the most common in terms of people actually engaging with it directly, but it's certainly the scam that people are most likely to have seen advertised during their time in EVE, at least if you've ever opened local in Jitter. Although right now that is flooded with far more advertising for Hypernet raffles than the venerable ISK doubler. And this scam is very simple and to some degree universal, as it doesn't involve any particular part of the EVE UI or gameplay to work. At its core, what an ISK doubler is trying to do is convince you that if you give him your money, he will be able to return it along with more money. Then instead of returning it with more money, you instead get no money and the ISK doubler laughs at you for trusting them. On top of this sits dozens of ways for the ISK doubler to try and engender your trust. Sock puppet accounts in local claiming the veracity of their service, API or wallet screenshots showing them having doubled ISK sent to them in the past, almost assuredly between alts they control, a set of long and labyrinthine rules that they assure you will get you your money from following, and my personal favourite, the practice of actually doubling small amounts of ISK that they think are testing them. This means if you slowly build up the ISK donations to a doubler, and they keep returning them, expecting the next donation to be bigger, and choose the right time to stop sending ISK back, you can effectively scam the scammer in a weird game of chicken. Overall, the biggest impact that ISK doubling has had is oddly cultural, with it being more of a touchstone of the scamming and social side of the game, people often joking about it or even actively participating in genuine ISK doubling for the sake of irony, which is why I will be doubling all of the ISK that anyone sends me within 24 hours of this video going live. Now, speaking of things that often get spammed in trade hubs, I'm sure many of you have seen a link to a contract entitled Hanger Clearout or something to that effect, with a huge price tag and a random assortment of items inside it. Most likely you closed it without giving it a second thought, and in doing so you managed to dodge one of the few scams in EVE in which the UI actually lies to you, and that's the margin trading or ghost order scam. If you look a little deeper into that contract, typically there will be one or two rare items inside it that might catch your eye as unusual, and if you checked out the market details of them, you'd find that there's either none for sale in the whole region or very few for sale at a remarkably high price. Accompanying this, you'll also see a buy order that seems like it would allow you to make money just by accepting the contract and then selling those rare items to that buy order. There's only one catch. If you actually follow through and accept the contract, then try and sell the items, you'll find that you're greeted with an error message telling you that the order cannot be found. If you go back and take a look at the market, you'll even see that the entry has disappeared, leaving you completely stuck with those items. And if you shift over to some neighbouring regions, you'll find, much to your disappointment, that they are not worth nearly as much as the insane price purported by that particular market, meaning that you just invested a few billion ISK in complete junk. How this actually works is that the scammer noticed a hole in the market for the region on a particularly low velocity item, and then put up a buy order for it on an alt with the skill margin trading, which at level 5 means you're only required to put 23.73% of the ISK of the face value of a buy order into it during creation, with the rest being taken out of the character's wallet when the order is fulfilled. If that character then, however, sends all their remaining ISK elsewhere, that prevents the order from being successfully fulfilled, as they don't have that money to pay that value when another player tries to sell them the item that they allegedly want. And that leads to that order being deleted and the player who tried to sell the item getting nothing. Now, there are ways to play around with this and scam the scammer by finding that item in another region and then selling it to that specific buy order for a price under the 23.73% mark that is often still much more than the item is actually worth, but will allow the order to complete. Still, of all the scams in EVE, this is the one that's both the easiest to fall for and, oddly enough, the one with the most real-life analogues, as it's effectively an online version of the violin scam. The next scam we're going to take a look at, though, whilst still relying on the greed of the victim to work, is a lot less sophisticated in its execution, and that's scamming through the use of contracts. The exact setup here will depend on how the scammer wants to try and justify their operation, the specific targets that they'll be aiming their scam at, and what resources they have access to. But there are two general underlying principles. The first is some way of making the person who is being scammed feel under pressure to accept the contract as fast as possible, by advertising it as a limited time offer or having someone else point it out as a mistake in local, all in the hopes that the victim doesn't fully read the details of the contract. And that's key to allow the second factor to kick in, which is some way of making the contract be less value than it might initially appear to be, by obscuring exactly what you'll be getting or paying. For example, a common way to do this is by presenting 3 contracts in local, say for healers, with the first 2 having already been accepted by the scammer at a price of 200 million ISK, and the final remaining contract being for 2 billion ISK. This means if you quickly checked the first contract and saw the deal, you might rush to accept that final one to try and get a cheap healer, only to find yourself down 2 billion ISK for your trouble. There are many other little tricks involved in that latter half, and all sorts of chicanery can take place. Contracts set up to seem like they're selling items only for you to actually be paying for them to take said item from you. Contracts set up with items that are very similarly named to expensive ones. You get the drift. In general, as with most scams, taking the time to read and pay attention to the UI can easily save you from a nasty loss. One of the more dastardly forms of scamming can also involve the use of deceptive contracts, and that's recruitment scamming, along with its lesser known and utilised brother, the Courier Scam. Much as with all the other scams listed here, this starts with the scammer gaining the victim's trust, but rather than luring them in with greed, as we've mostly seen through these previous examples, instead membership in an organisation that the victim wants to become a part of is used as the motivating factor, typically ones that don't normally accept outsiders, like the nascent goon swarm of yesteryear, which was infamous for pulling off this scam. What typically happens is that the scammer offers the victim a vouch into this organisation, provided they pay a fee, whilst building up what awaits the victim when they're finally allowed to join this group, promising riches and free space or comradeship, whatever it is that they particularly want. Now, sometimes the scam will end when the fee is sent over and the ruse is revealed, but it often goes a step further, with the quote-unquote new recruit being asked to set up a courier contract to his new home to allow all his stuff to be moved there. What the victim is likely not aware of is that courier contracts don't actually force you to move the items in question, and you can very easily just cancel the contract to fail it, resulting in the items that were supposed to be being moved just being deposited in the scammer's hangar with no penalty to them, and no means of recourse to the victim, unless they had placed a collateral on the actual courier contract. And this specific mechanic is what underpins the courier variation of this general scam, with the scammer offering cheap or free hauling services only to steal whatever they were supposed to move. Regardless, with everything that can be taken from them taken, the victim is then informed that they have been scammed, and as you might expect, is not invited to join that closed organisation, leaving them penniless and often very, very mad. This is actually one of the few scams that I think is actively damaging to the game, as the very existence of it makes a lot of more casual players wary of trying to join nullsec organisations, having heard horror stories about this, and the total extent of what can be stolen is so big that it can even lead to players quitting the game, which, regardless of your opinion on how much they deserve to be scammed, is never something that's really good for EVE long term. Still, as a general rule for people who want to avoid walking into things like this, if someone tries to charge you for being a member of a corporation or an alliance without it being a tax on your earnings or something similar, then it's probably a scam and you should look elsewhere for corporations. Now, the final scam type that I want to talk about here, unlike all the others that we've covered, doesn't tend to be initiated within the game itself, but on the market discussion section of the forums, or on Reddit, or some other place where longer tracks of text are easier to put out. In spaces like this, you'll find all the financial flimflammery that you'd expect from a game that's almost marketed at the kind of people who have at least an intellectual appetite for all the white-collar crime that the SCC might get in the way of in the real world, ranging from the most basic of Ponzi schemes to entire fake banks and investment schemes. Trying to talk about this in generic terms is going to be difficult, as there are genuine investment opportunities in EVE, and all of these scams try their best to follow the trends of those and disguise themselves within it to try and seem as genuine as possible. So the best thing to do is just to look out for two things. The first is towards history, as most people who can repeatedly gain a percentage return on ISK have done it before and have proven records to work with. And the second is just asking yourself the simple question of, is this too good to be true? As a monthly return of 10% plus, or whatever enticement the scammer is using, will likely be far better than the market rate, meaning that they must have some sort of ulterior motive for having such a high reward. One of the biggest examples of a successful scheme like this folded in 2011, when the Phaser Inc. Ponzi scheme came to light, after running for several months on a weekly rate of 5% returns and gaining steam at an inordinate pace over that period. The operators of this scheme, Eddie Lampert and Mordor Exuel, sensing that the pool of investors that fueled the pyramid was about to run dry, bailed out, splitting a sweet trillion-isk of ill-gotten gains between them. On reflection though, I have to say that scams are as much of a part of the mythos and social fabric of EVE Online as spies and shooting spaceships are. And I have to say that having grown up around all sorts of tactics like this has given me a great deal of healthy suspicion that I believe has probably contributed to me not being scammed in real life, although it's not like I have much to be scammed away from in the first place. Still, I know you guys enjoyed taking a look at the darker side of EVE, so I hope this particular video has tickled that itch and left you with a similar level of proper paranoia about handing your money over to people who you don't know. I'm looking to try and make the next list video like this on something equally dark, with a list of the top 5 betrayals in EVE history, but I'm always interested in hearing more suggestions, so feel free to let me know what you'd like to hear about in the comments below. Anyway, a special thanks as always goes out to our Crassuses, Pinche Infidel from Old School, Brood from Triumvirate and Zolka Lando, as well as to the other $5 patrons in Dustin Prater, Crazy Daisy, Zar, Olav Olden, Kem, Raphael, Big Bada Boom, Dunk Dinkle, and the Ashfell Federation. If you want to support the channel yourself, you can either check out the Patreon and PayPal links in the description below, or if you'd like, just share the video with some other people who you think might enjoy it. After all, advertisement is the best thing you can give me. Until next time though, have a good day and fly smart.